Hi, everyone, and welcome to Safe Space for White Questions. Apologies for our technical times. These things happen, and I like to believe that good things are worth waiting for. So hopefully you'll find our conversations today as useful as we do. We always enjoy chatting with you. My name is Ajay Parasram. I am an associate professor in the Departments of International Development Studies and History at Dalhousie University in Chibuktuk, unceded Mi'kmaq territories out here on the East Coast. And I'm here with my partner in crime, Alex Kasnabish, Alex, why don't you introduce yourself to the people?
Sure. Hi, everyone. My name is Alex Kasnabish, as AJ just said. I sell my labor for a wage at Mount St. Vincent University. But I do more interesting things than that in my spare time, like talking with you all here. Welcome.
Mm-hmm. I've also seen him do some pretty sweet stick fighting. So among other things, we have other hobbies. This month, we are doing a themed issue, one of our fabled themed issues on the subject of defunding the police. We've kind of had a lot of chatter over the last month. Those of you who are based in Halifax would have no doubt seen in the news. Probably those of you anywhere in Canada would have seen in the news the kind of unchecked police violence that was associated with the removal of housing. This no doubt prompted the kind of public desire to have a guided theme this week or this month on defunding the police. So that's what we decided to do. And of course, post your live questions. We have a few that have come in, and we're going to take, I think, one or two that we didn't get to from last month. But why don't we just jump right into it? We'll go for an hour. So the first question we have is, what is defunding and why has it become so popular? So I'll kick us off. And I suppose I should tell, for those of you who have never tuned in before, the way Safe Space for White Questions work is questions come into us anonymously and we answer them. We just take turns answering them. So I'm going to answer them first and pass it off to Alex, and we're just going to keep on going until we come up to an hour. So what is defunding? Defunding the police is, broadly speaking, a public policy approach guided by grassroots activists that's designed to reallocate the resources that the city, province, etc., currently invests into the carceral system, specifically for the purpose of funding, like police, and says we can do a better job. We can create efficiencies, whatever kind of terms it is you want to use. We can do a better job of keeping society safe if we take money away from the formal police and invest it in other things like social housing, things like guaranteed livable incomes, things that actually help people who are in precarious situations kind of find their footing again. And it's difficult to come up with a really precise definition for defunding because it's something that is a bit of a moving target. It's something that in an abstract form, I think grassroots activists, and especially Black and Black women activists, have been talking about in some shape or form for many dozens of years, probably like even longer, in part because of the history of policing and its linkages to, trying to round up enslaved people who had escaped from the plantations. And so there's kind of always been this kind of acrimonious aspect of policing, or here in Canada with the RCMP, who were created as a sort of colonial enterprise to quote unquote clear the prairies for white settlement. So there's definitely a super long answer to why defunding, but the reason why it's been popular in recent days is because in recent years is in part because of the very extreme acts of violence experienced by Black and Indigenous people in particular, but people of color more generally, at the hands of police officers who have been armed by the state and funded in very significant ways by the state to kind of be jacks of all trade, to just do anything. Anytime something goes wrong, the tendency is to call the police and get them to deal with it. They're not trained for it. They're structurally designed to be a punishing kind of violent force. That's the purpose of policing historically. So they're pretty ill-suited for doing things, and especially when it comes to engaging with people who may have mental illnesses, who may be struggling with various intersections of structural oppression. they have proven themselves time and time again to be a very poor choice of people to intervene. So the idea of defunding comes out of that. In the context of Chibuktuk Halifax, there's been a commission started last year that's led by our colleague and friend and Black feminist Elle Jones in the city. And part of her mandate has been to basically search through the community and figure out what the community believes defunding is and what it ought to look like. So she's been heading up a committee that's been having a series of lengthy meetings with community members to understand better what they need defunding to look like. And I don't believe they've filed their report on the definition yet. But, you know, this is the sort of thing that on the one hand, as Elle has explained elsewhere, on the one hand, we could just easily come up with a definition, but to do it in a grassroots community accountable way involves going to the community and kind of learning about the issues at the grassroots level. And that's what Elle and others who are involved in this have been doing. So yeah, Alex, to you, my friend.
Yeah, that was a great definition. I don't have too much to add. I will throw a couple of things in there. I guess I would say that obviously defunding has become a more prominent initiative in recent years because of the fairly high-profile murders of Black and Indigenous folks, especially at the hands of police across Turtle Island, particularly in the United States, but really not limited to there. It's still kind of a tragedy that most Canadians can name off victims of police killing in the States, but don't know the names of people who've been executed by police in our own backyard. So, you know, please don't think if you reside in the settler colonial state of Canada that this is simply an American problem and not here, first of all. So that's been something that really raised the profile. But I want to give a shout out again to the excellent work of our friend and comrade Chris Dixon, whose book Another Politics is really seminal reading. So in Another Politics, Chris talks about the history of radical collective liberation struggles. And one of the main struggles, he says, informs the best strands of radical politics today is the movement for police and prison abolition and the way it intersects with Black feminism particularly. And that's simply because you do not create a liberated society by arming it to the teeth and then asking the institutions that you have armed to the teeth and charged with the protection of the most prominent and powerful people in that society and their interests to solve all your problems. You're not going to end up somewhere better than where you started off. So, you know, even if you're one of these people who's like, well, what about all the dangerous people out there? You know, do you really think you need somebody who's armed and prepared to use deadly violence to stop you if your taillight's out, you know, when you're driving down the street, or if you blow like 15 kilometers an hour over the speed limit? Does that person need to be stopping you and giving you a ticket? Why are those people the same people who deal with houseless people, who deal with people in crisis? Like, why would you go into your mechanic and say, I've had a headache for 5 days, can you take a look? Like, would you come to a university and say, you know, I would like to, maybe this is a bad example because you might go to an engineering department and ask that, but would you come to a sociology department and say, I'd like to engage in subsoil mineral exploitation. Can you help me dig a big hole? You know, so why would we have one institution in this society that's charged with all those kinds of things? Another point I think that's worth making is that while public funding for all kinds of public institutions has declined dramatically over the last 50 years, police budgets consistently go up and up and up and up. And once again, that happened in Halifax. It happened everywhere, despite the fact all these calls to reallocate funds to other community services to help people in crisis. So the police actually take up a huge portion of our public funds. And in Canada, those funds come from property taxes, things like that, right? So what the municipality could be doing to fund schools or, community events or things to make your life more livable, maybe street lights to make your walk home safer, maybe funding for shelters so houseless people and people struggling with addictions issues could get the help they need, is instead going to fund this paramilitary organization. The final point I'm going to make, because AJ has really covered the roots of this a little bit, well, maybe one more shout out. If you're interested in this history, there's so many good books to read. Robin Maynard, which we've, just like really held up as an incredible scholar, an excellent book published by our friends at Fernwood. Policing Black Lives is absolutely essential reading. Obviously, the work of Angela Davis, obviously the work of L. Jones, Desmond Cole. You got to read The Skin We're In. But aside from that, the roots to this seemingly intractable problem have been super well investigated by a journalist by the name of Robert Evans. He's got an awesome podcast called Behind the Bastards. You should really check it out. One, he's done a short series in the midst of that podcast called Behind the Police. And he basically excavates right back to ancient times, the roots of modern policing. And it's super fascinating. It's obviously kind of focused. He's an American, so focuses a bit more on the United States, but on Europe too. Not so much on not really on Canada at all, but super informative reading and or listening. And it gives you a sense of like where this stuff came from. And the simple and short answer is the cops arise at the moment when the rich decide they need to have an armed paramilitary force to protect their property interests, okay? So ask yourself why the police are always responding to crimes against property and property relations, and why that's some of the most important things that get defended in our society. That's not some natural law. That's a function of that institution. So fund it because the rest of us don't actually benefit from that. Mm-hmm. Back to you, AJ.
Great. Thanks for that, Alex. So we're moving right along then. The next question is, who decides what defunding looks like, and has it happened anywhere? So I'll start answering this question by first kind of reminding everyone a little bit about what this space is, right? So we are not, Alex and I, we don't claim to be experts in all the various things that we're talking about. The purpose of Safe Space for White Questions was to have people who have some idea about many different things related to race and white fragility to kind of help along predominantly white people deepen their understanding. I won't speak for Alex, he'll speak for himself, but I know that I haven't been personally involved in a lot of these things, so I don't know the details about like whether or not defunding has happened elsewhere in the concrete terms. You can probably find a lot of that stuff just from kind of internet searches. Maybe some places in the United States have been a little bit further. I will talk a bit more broadly about it and encourage folks to, like check out the committee's work that L. Jones has been doing. They've been doing consultations and surveys for the last several months through the summer. So there's been lots of opportunity for community members, at least here in Halifax, to participate in those conversations. But more broadly, I think to understand the question of who decides what defunding looks like and has it happened anywhere. Obviously in Halifax, the approach that we've been taking has been the community should decide what defunding looks like. The consequence of that is it's going to look different in lots of different places. It might look like, maybe removing, in some places, maybe police officers shouldn't have guns, to go to every call, or maybe they have a designated person who's armed for particular sort of things like, violent crimes that are happening in process. It may in other places look like we don't want any police at all, or maybe we want police who only come, maybe some indigenous bands or something to decide that they want to do their own policing or their own kind of like maintenance of order. So it's going to be a really diverse sort of thing. And I think this is an important tendency to keep in mind, is that when confronted with a radical idea, and this is a radical idea in the truest sense of the word, which is to come from the root, to think about kind of reorganizing society in a way that is useful, that serves the grassroots. But when we think about a radical idea, it's very easy to want to just kind of like abstractly poke all the holes in the world through it. But if you think about like kind of how absurd most of the ideas that are mainstream part of, like settler society today, before they would have been mainstream and put into practice and developed over practice, they would have seemed absolutely like bananas as well. Like the idea of a driver's license, that somehow you should submit your credentials to the state who's going to say you are who you say you are, and that's going to have some kind of meaning across borders, and that allows you to operate a vehicle that can kill people with ease. You know what I mean? Like that's kind of a ludicrous proposition until you see it play out over practice. The same kind of thing can be said about projects like defunding the police, especially when you think about what, again, we've talked about this a little bit, but what the relationship between the police and the state actually is. And if you think about it, what it is, the police are the violent extension of state power. And I mean that in a descriptive way. I don't mean that, I'm not trying to pass judgment about what the police are and what they aren't. I'm just saying that the way that society, the way that the state operates is that they will try to get your consent. And when they do not have your consent, they will enforce their will and their power, which is understood in democracies to be democratic because people go and vote every couple of years. But they will enforce that with the use of violence. And that's what the police do. So in some sense, we miss a big part of the picture if we focus only on the police when we think about the application of power. Certainly when the police go and do something violent, we absolutely should criticize the police, but we also have to be mindful of the policymakers, the mayors, the police chief bureaus, the premiers and the prime ministers, and all of the people who are part of these systems that continue to give the mandate of policing what it does. That's why I think defunding is such a useful way to be thinking about this, because we are actually all implicated in this system that sustains the society in which we live. So if you've got a problem with that, and I think maybe many of you do, then it's incumbent on us to try to remove ourselves, remove our resources from this. And there are many ways that people do that. I think what's been driving a lot of these movements have been grassroots activism that's trying to protect Black lives and Indigenous lives, because people's lives are at stake every single day. But the deeper seated issue actually is much deeper than policing itself. Policing is kind of the last point of the state's application of power. So we need to be actually very critical of the state that legitimizes and authorizes this manifestation of coercive violence. And the police is one outcome. The carceral system itself is another one that disproportionately locks up Black and Brown and Indigenous people. So, I just wanted to flag that this is part of the reason why the solutions and what defunding looks like from one jurisdiction to another is going to be different. Alex?
Yeah, that was great and really comprehensive. And again, I think I just have bits to add around the outside, maybe from my perspective. So as AJ said, defunding has kind of a long legacy in many ways. It's one approach to taking on this seemingly intractable problem of a major institution in these gigantic societies that we live in, that kind of naturalize all these relations of oppression, right? Am I muted? No.
Okay. Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, sorry. Confusion reigns. There, we're all good. So that naturalizes all these things that, as AJ was pointing out in the driver's license, like if you had been around at the moment that, like, I don't know, private property relations were instituted, the first time somebody like came up with the wacky idea to give out humongous bank loans that tie you to a debt sentence for the rest of your life so you can have the privilege of living in a home, if you can even get that. That would have seemed like, what? Why would I even do that? That's madness. The first time somebody instituted, like, I don't know, heteropatriarchal relations across the society, all these things would have seen. The first time somebody decided, hey, I'm going to put seeds in the ground here and grow a field full of crops and live here all the time rather than following animals and seasonal patterns and sustaining myself, that would have seemed totally bonkers, and probably actually was, if we're to believe the evidence. Anyway, so all these things, like, I know it's hard, right? We all struggle with this because, like, one of the things about, coming to maturity in a society is that you, like, it's like the air you breathe, the water you drink, it all becomes just the context that surrounds you and you take it for granted. But we can't really afford to assume that what is around us is simply the way things always have been, the way they always will be. Because then how will we ever address the big problems we're confronting, right? Like climate change, like police violence. So defunding has been an upward slope, I would say, in across Turtle Island for the last couple of years. There was great promise in it, especially in the United States in the aftermath of the police murder of George Floyd. Many city councils passed resolutions calling for defunding, and they have all been watered down in the years since, frankly. You know, that's the upshot. Some city councils are still taking this on. Some of them are considering it. Some, like in Halifax, have approached this like fairly bureaucratically with a lot of top-down control. That's not any shade thrown on the hard work of our friend and colleague Elle Jones or the work she and her team are doing, but it's a way of exhausting people, frankly. Endless consultations. Oh, should we wear body cameras? You know, like who was watching? If you're in Kijipuktuk, did you see, you know, before the cops rioted last week, how they pulled their name tags off? It's supposed to be illegal for police to do that, right? Funny how when we're gearing up for a cop riot, they make sure they're totally unidentifiable, right? Great. Oh, body cameras. Oh, just by chance, the body camera was off at that moment, didn't capture that interaction. You don't know the context. Pulling from another thing that Robert Evans says about this, one thing that's super, super interesting for those of you who are big on police keep us safe, the thin blue line against, you know, between civilization and anarchy, although bring on the anarchy, I say anarchy isn't chaos. Anarchy means without rulers, right? So, but for those of you who think like the cops are the line between chaos and order, think about when soldiers are deployed to a battlefield, to a war zone. Soldiers who are trained to exercise deadly force all the time have rules of engagement. They're very strict ones usually, like this is who you can shoot at, this is when you can engage, this is when you can't. Police are literally trained to use deadly violence if they believe their life is in danger. And their training often involves this hyped up, every situation means you're in danger. So they're, you know, constantly. So when you wonder why, despite the fact that crime rates have declined dramatically over the last half century, and yet police killings seem to go up and up and up, this is in part why, right? Because you arm and train a group of people who you tell are constantly like on the cutting edges of this system and are going to confront dangerous people. Well, they end up using that violence that they are given license to use. And so they solve, like, you know, it's an old cliche. When you're a hammer, everything looks like a nail. And this is the awful and brutal truth of that, right? So defunding is one prong in the attempt to take some of the teeth out of this institution. So the cops in Halifax wanted their tank, right? They wanted to buy a tank. Why do they need a tank? I don't know. Like nobody knows. The cops couldn't tell you why they needed a tank, but they want their shiny toys, right? So that goes into the police budget. And that one was fended off, I believe, successfully. But like that, when that's the metric for your wins, like, oh, we prevented our police force from buying a tank that would normally have been deployed in Iraq or Afghanistan, on the streets of Halifax. That's a pretty crummy win. You know, our hospitals don't have enough ICU beds in the middle of a pandemic. Maybe that should be a priority. Maybe rather than approaching mask wearing and social distancing as a problem that should be enforced by police, having more public health workers, having a more robust social support system. Hey, maybe the province could have actually mailed out 100 pack of masks to every household out of the pennies they stripped from a police budget, making the ability to weather that storm a little bit more affordable, or home COVID tests or whatever. Like you could come up with a billion reasons, like parties in the park, like live music on the weekends, a pavilion on the commons where kids get to go and play in shitty weather, things that actually bring community together. Again, for those of you who, like, I don't disagree, and we're probably going to come to this in a minute, that you need a force in society prepared to address like violent people and dangerous situations. I don't disagree with that, actually. I think it's utopian to believe that we won't ever have, situations where we need people prepared to use force to defend our communities. One of the movements I respect most, the Zapatistas, have always said that, like we don't treat these things in some utopian, oh, we're all going to sit around, get rid of the cops and sing Kumbaya kind of thing. But it's a very different proposition to suggest like we could have a limited, focused force prepared to respond to those kinds of threats, like a mass shooter, for example, versus, yeah, like, oh, I'm going to get a speeding ticket, and the dude racing up behind me with his lights on has like, you know, both a gun on his belt and pepper spray and is like armed and entitled to use deadly force if I cause him a problem. And especially if the melanin content in my skin doesn't match what he likes or he expects. So these kinds of questions like are super hard to address. And I think the first step along that way is to take some of that money that the police now get on the regular and distribute it to the people who are actually doing the frontline work that are making our communities better, doing needle exchange programs, helping out folks who are houseless, finding secure employment, providing the necessary supports that we all know are increasingly hard to access. Doesn't seem like rocket science to me, and especially when we think about the fact that most what we call criminal activity in our society, most of it is related to poverty. Most of it is related to situations of endemic violence, right? So when you think about the kids who end up in foster care, for example, in group homes, in that foster care group home to prison pipeline, why are they there? They're there disproportionately because they're coming from extremely drug addicted, impoverished homes where their parents often struggled with those kinds of issues themselves. They were abused, they were impoverished. Intergenerational poverty and abuse is absolutely 100% real. And that informs what people do going forward. Police, they don't make society safer. And so, it's like the climate change question. You can keep throwing money at corporations and trying to convince them to pollute less. But that clearly isn't going to get us to where we need to go. So too, I would suggest with the police, but it's not an easy solution. So I hear it when people are frustrated with the fact that defunding doesn't have sort of a tighter and more focused definition attached to it. Back to you, AJ.
Yeah, thanks for that, Alex. I wanted to add to some of that, just the point that where were we here? No, I forgot the point. I'll come back to it when I answer the next question. So the next question is, I get that police should not be the ones to respond to things like mental health issues, but what about dangerous people? If we defund the police, who will help us when we're facing something like a home invasion? So I think in many ways, Alex already spoke to this point. And I would say, this is obviously things that abolitionists have been thinking about for a very long time. The police is just one particular way that we have decided in society. We have decided in society to organize the violent enforcement of rules that are supposed to be collectively agreed upon. There are many other ways that we could think about doing that. There are many other ways that we could have, whether it's community associations or whether it's, some fundamentally changed policing system that would respond to violent crimes. But also, again, to echo some of what Alex was saying in the answer to the last question, is this is a long-term strategy, right? This is not something that happens overnight and a problem is solved. That never happens in any aspect of public policy. How long have we been trying in public policy terms to end boil water advisories on indigenous reserves? A very simple issue that Canada actually goes around internationally in terms of international development and aid, trying to tell other countries about how to dig a well or something like that. And Canada can't even sort out the kind of budgetary issues necessary to accomplish this very simple goal. And we look at this and we tend to throw our hands up in the air and be like, how can we not figure this out? Well, we can't figure it out because that's how structural white supremacy operates in Canada, right? It's because some people who are not white are seen as lesser people, less deserving of the state's collective resources than others. And the carceral state demonstrates this time and time again. There's a really good book that's going to be coming out, published by our pals in Fernwood and by another friend of ours here in Halifax named Ardith Wynot, called, Insurgent Love. And I haven't had the chance to read the book, but I've heard a lot about the book. And it talks a lot about, what do you do with quote unquote dangerous people who are in the community? And it takes a kind of like deep dive into aspects of rehabilitative justice. And I would add, having not read the book yet, probably might look at, the kind of long-term structural changes that are necessary to create the kinds of spaces, community spaces, community farms, so that people don't have to struggle for food. That can address the systemic and make an intervention into the inertia of intergenerational traumas that put people into precarious situations where they have to commit petty theft to sustain themselves. And I think we really need to, this is a point I'm going to keep coming back to. We really need to understand the violence that we experience in the news and on the streets by police as a function of the state more generally. Because it is a enormous public policy failure that in a country that is one of the wealthiest, most resource endowed, most privileged places on planet Earth, a place like Canada, that we have the kinds of systematic exclusions that we just turn a blind eye to, that homelessness exists at all in a country with the kind of resources that what we have. If this were a hardworking developing country with the resources that we have right now, I can tell you as a scholar of international development studies, they could have sorted this out a long time ago. So Canada needs to do a much better job of actually understanding that it is not only propertied white people who matter in public policy. And we have had over 150 years of practice that says only propertied white men and then eventually propertied white women matter as public policy issues. We have built electoral systems modeled after feudal systems that are designed to privilege this over and over again, such that the police are essentially the protectors of private property. You know what I mean? So if you are not propertied and if you're trying to just live, you are a problem for people who have property. And at some level, it really is as basic and material as that. And it's one of the reasons why, if you become propertied, then maybe like the fact that, my skin is too brown might make me seem as less of a threat. As a person who has looked very much like a threat to the kind of lens of structural white supremacy for most of my life, I can tell you that now that I enjoy the relative class privilege of having a stable job and a home that I live in, that I own, I am viewed differently in society. And that upsets me greatly, actually. This is not something that I'm proud of. This is not an accomplishment. This is a function of understanding the intricacies of how structural white supremacy plays out in the violence of the state. And it's disgusting, to be honest with you. And I think we should all be disgusted with the fact that, we are encouraged in society to mobilize one form of structural oppression to help us, push other people down rather than lift us all up when we have more than enough resources to live better. So anyway, sorry for a bit of a rant there, but I'll pass it off to Alex.
You shouldn't apologize for that rant. First of all, I rant all the time, but that was a great rant. I thought that was very, very real. And people need to hear that, right? Like if you're one of those people who sits around and, worries about people taking stuff from you and you think the police are the line that defends you from those people, you should ask yourself what kind of world you live in, not blame yourself for it, but you should ask what kind of world do I live in where I need this armed paramilitary force to protect my stuff from people who don't have any stuff. Why is the world like that? Why can Jeff Bezos go to space for 4 minutes in his penis rocket and then, people in Halifax can't live on the peninsula anywhere because they don't make enough money, right? To your question, I hate, please don't think this is I'm not trying to be patronizing here. But do you think if you got home invaded, the police would come? How would they help you? Would you be able to make it to a phone and call them? If they when was the last time you heard police foil home invasion stop home invaders, save people from that. Never happens. It's like you call the cops, even if you get through right in time, they're there later on, right? They don't stop murders. They don't stop rapes. You never like there's literally never been an incident where they're like, oh my God, the police arrived just in time and stopped that person from being brutally murdered. That thing was already happening. They show up on the scene later on. And police, like legendarily, unfortunately, don't take sexual assault seriously at all. So look at this incredibly disgusting history of destroyed evidence, of rape kits that sit in police, evidence lockers for years and decades untouched, of the compelling and overwhelming testimony from the survivors of those assaults that they were discouraged, often by police themselves and sometimes by Crown attorneys, from doing it and offering their, like, again and again and again, right? So like the problem is we live in a society, and I'm not trying to be hard on you, like this is me too, right? And I grew up this way. I'm sure you did too. We live in a society saturated in propaganda, whether it's cops in capes, cops like who fly and have power rings and have whatever magical ability, or cops who are dressed up like ninjas, or cops who are like special for, like the number of TV shows and movies that celebrate this idea of police being superheroes in so many different forms fills our imagination with this idea that we would be completely unsafe without them. And it's bullshit. It's just bullshit. There's a mountain of evidence that suggests the opposite. And in fact, they make our societies worse off because the average cop makes really good money. If you think AJ and I are overpaid, wait till I tell you what a cop makes. You can look this stuff up on sunshine lists. 6 figures isn't hard to make for a police officer. And the rationale is, oh, it's a dangerous job, right? Well, lots of things are dangerous jobs. Being a garbage collector is a potentially dangerous job. Do you think they make $100,000 a year? So I'm going to recommend a couple of things here real quick for those of you looking for resources. 2 excellent books around this that I haven't recommended before. One is called The End of Policing by Alex Vitale. Again, it's a book about what we could do beyond this, like, totally perverse, broken, and inefficient, dramatically inefficient carceral punitive system. And the other one is Policing the Planet, which is an edited collection by Jordan Camp and Christina Heatherton. Both are excellent, excellent books in addition to the ones we've already recommended about just these issues and problems. And I encourage you to check them out. There are lots of people who've been doing work on this, actually. The mainstream critique tends to be, oh, but what are your solutions? Give me a blueprint. Well, I'm not actually an expert in this area, as AJ was saying about us, but there are people who are and who have done lots of work in this area, and lots of community-based activists who've done a ton of work, like working to keep their communities safe, not just from bad elements in their community, but from the cops, because the cops are part of that problem, right? Part of that cycle of endless violence. And yeah, I'm certainly a kind of person, I really have very little patience for people who tell me, oh, it's okay, like crime will just disappear. What we call crime anyway, will disappear once we get rid of the police or get rid of poverty. These things that, like, getting rid of poverty will mean confronting capitalism. It's such a long-term project. I'm totally there for it. But in the short term, we are going to have to be serious about the fact that once in a while, somebody's going to try and, do you harm, right? Well, how do you address that? How do you keep your community safe? For me, that's like community self-defense, right? Just like I practice martial arts because I believe both in the sport aspect of it, but also in like personal self-defense. Yeah, like I think that is, somebody wants to bring violence into the world against me, I'm prepared to meet it that way, hopefully, right? I don't want to be a purveyor of it, but I don't want to be a victim of it. And that's real. Like when I visited Zapatista territory in Chiapas, they made no bones about that. They treat rape very, very harshly in communities. They take theft very seriously. They don't allow drugs or alcohol in their communities because of the history of colonial abuse of those substances to destroy the communities. So of course they don't have police, because their experience with police has been like police disappearing community members, police torturing and murder community members, police rape community members, right? So they don't want anything to do with that. But they do have elements in their communities who are beholden to the will and control of those communities who serve that function, but who are not divorced from it, are not some super institutional force that stand above society, working for the interests of the ruling class and against everybody else. So I hope that, like, I know some of this is definitely hard, but yeah, just like if you were getting beaten up on the street, maybe if a cop drove by and saw it happening right at that moment. But the fact is that almost never happens. You never hear, like, in the media would love to run those stories. Hero cop intervenes. In fact, what you hear are stories about somebody stepped up, right? Like those awful, a couple of years ago, if you remember that in Portland, Oregon, that awful situation where 2 Muslim women were being harassed on the train. And there wasn't a security guard or a cop in sight. Who stood up? 3 community members to confront the guy. And they ended up like facing awful violence. 2 of them died as a result of their attempt to intervene. That's horrible, but that's the community taking a risk and standing up. The police didn't save them and wouldn't have saved them in any case. So, and if your response to that is, well, we should just have police everywhere all the time, then, well, I mean, go visit Latin America, because a lot of their societies look like that. And I can tell you it has not led to less violence in the streets, less corruption, or less abuse. So, I mean, we can and we must do better. Back to you, AJ.
Yeah, thanks for that. I guess the thing I wanted to add, I remembered it now, is also, again, to highlight. So I've been constantly kind of pushing us to remember the implications of the state here. But I think the kind of even more abstract but important point here is to remember that we're talking about structures, right? So especially as Alex kind of described there, oftentimes it might just be somebody who happens to be in the right place at the right time will intervene because they're a good person and they understand that that's the case. Some of those people might be cops. Some of those people might not be cops. But the structural aspect of policing is kind of what we're talking about when we're thinking about the kind of budgetary considerations, the micro policy details of what defunding the police looks like and why we do it. So especially for those who are kind of hesitant, obviously, especially in a place like Halifax, myself included, we have family members who are individually police officers, right, or military people, or otherwise implicated in various arms of settler colonialism. The point that we're trying to stress here is not that your relative or yourself, if you're one of these people, the point is not that you as an individual is bad. We've said this a few times, and I think it's worth reiterating. At the level of structural analysis, individuals don't matter. And sometimes that's hard to take, right? Especially if you're feeling a little fragile or emotional or like we're kind of hitting at it a little bit too hard. But the truth of the matter is you cannot design public policy with individuals in mind. You have to think about the broader structures. So you might have, 20% of the police force who grew up with like the hero mentality that want to do this work, that sort of thing. Those very same people could then end up taking on more heroic roles in other institutions that are not as implicated. You know what I mean? Because everybody was human before they were whatever else they decided to be later in life. So there is an emancipatory project at the root of projects like, defunding the police. And I think that we need to keep our focus as well on collective liberation. And this is one path to collective liberation. And it actually, I think, would improve the lives of many people, even those who are involved in the police system right now, who might be trying to do good things and infinitely stymied time and time again by the various forces of bureaucracy that prevent that from happening. So if we were to think of it in a broad policy sense, if we had been trying to accomplish vaccination efforts for 150, 200 years, and we kept failing to accomplish that, outcome, we would probably have tried something else by now. But policing as a structure, while it has gone through like various iterations, we have never questioned the idea that maybe we don't need to have armed police doing this work right now. So in a sense, we are asking, I think everyone is asking, to really like cut loose your imagination and actually think about kind of how bananas this situation is that we're in right now. so that we can think about something else. Because if we don't take the step to think about what something new looks like, we're just going to end up remaining in this vicious cycle that has awful connotations, particularly for people who are not white. So I wanted to say that in part because the next two questions we have here are actually not specifically about policing, but by all means, post a live question if you are interested in continuing the policing conversation. But the next question we have, I'll read it out loud. It's kind of a couple questions that are grouped together. So why don't you consider Europeans indigenous to Europe? Is there an indigenous European struggle? Why do Native Americans have a right to this land, but Native Europeans don't have a right to their own? Can we ever expect the Mayor of London to say, we stand on the unceded territory of the English tribes? So there's a lot in that question. And the first thing I would say is to invoke one of my friends, Dr. Lynn Gale, who is Anishinaabe, an Algonquin scholar who lives in Peterborough, is not associated with the university. But one of the things that she's taught me is that everybody is indigenous somewhere. And the processes of separation that have taken people away from their indigenous knowledge systems is what has kind of like compromised people's relationship to indigeneity, and it's always related to land. So it's not that Europeans are not indigenous. Of course, Europeans have indigenous roots and heritage to different parts of the world. But I think I'd be remiss if we didn't kind of pick up on the kind of connotations in this question that there's an insinuation of equality here, right? There's like a false pretense of equality. And the truth is, I don't think we can draw equivalencies in the same way. The term unceded territory means something very specific. It's related to military policy. It means literally that land was not ceded. So the processes in Western Europe that led to the consolidation and formation of things like the English state and later the Scottish state and Ireland and all these other things, there were wars, there were alliances, there was concessions. The historical processes are not the same, and they're not the same all over the world, and this is why, so the international relations across Turtle Island has a history of 10,000 years. That settler colonial society only cares to historicize the last 500 years is our detriment as settlers, because, like the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, for example, has been a process of international relations that has over 1,000 years of history that has managed the international relations across various different nations at different times that have even people have kind of put it into practice to protect Black lives more contemporarily in the last couple of years. So there is a vibrant politics and international relations that's grounded to territory, that's grounded to the various indigenous nations across Turtle Island. And that when they say that land is unceded, it means that the British and the Canadians did not succeed in conquering them. And that's a historical phenomenon, right? We have treaties across most of this territory that explicitly say that the land is not ceded. You know what I mean? Go back and you can go, those of you in Halifax, you can just go down the street from where I am and you can read the treaties of peace and friendship. The physical documents, they're right there for everybody to read. And I encourage you to do it because it's very explicit that it's an agreement about sharing, and it does not have to do with the ceding of territory. So why then? So to answer the question then, why is there not an Indigenous European struggle? I mean, perhaps there is. I don't study it. I don't know too much about it, but certainly there's lots of different kinds of national struggles in Europe that you could be looking at. And the term Native American, so even that term itself, I think, is a problematic term. The various nations all have their own names and should be used. The concept of America is itself a settler colonial one. So why would the Mayor of London not say we stand on the unceded territory of the English tribes? If there were English tribes that were trying to assert their sovereignty over their territory that was grounded in a relationship to land, then maybe that mayor could do that. I think it's interesting, actually, because the mayor of London is actually a Muslim brown man, right? What's his name? Sadiq Khan, maybe? I forget. So I would think that he would be happy to do that. if that were the case. But again, these terms have histories. So the territory is not unceded, like nobody's organized around their relationship to their indigenous languages or indigenous knowledges that have been systematically attacked by an invasive state to essentially commit genocide against them. So there's a tendency to want to look for, to want to broaden the idea of colonialism and the idea of oppression so that we can apply it everywhere, and through that process make the concept meaningless. It's the last step of settler colonialism in the literature that talks about the indigenization of the oppressor. And I think that that's a really important point to keep in mind, because the asserting of indigenous knowledge systems that are, indigenous friends all over the territory are doing is an act of reclamation that has no equivalence in Europe. So we have to be very careful. In my personal opinion, I don't think we should even be using the term colonial to refer to things that happened before 1492. For me, colonialism, if you want to be clear and analytical about it, are the processes that have unfolded since 1492 onwards. We need to have a start and an end point. It needs to be conceptually clear, and there are other forms of oppression to be thinking about, So this doesn't mean that empire didn't happen. There's loads of imperialism. It didn't mean that violent state formation didn't happen in many iterations all over the world. And it certainly doesn't mean that Europe has, a monopoly over the use of violence. I teach a seminar class called Becoming the State, where we look at case studies in Europe and Turtle Island and South Asia, and we try and study basically a kind of quasi-anarcho history of state formation in these different areas to see how they kind of come together. And there's a lot of good work on that. I'd highly recommend James C. Scott's work, Becoming the State, or no, Seeing Like a State from 1985. And Alex will probably know the other one from 2009 about not being governed. Anyway, I'll pass it off to Alex, but that's my answer to that question.
Yeah, thanks for that, AJ. The other Scott book that I think I'd recommend, maybe you're thinking about, is Against the Grain, a history of the earliest states, right? It really, in that, Scott really debunks some of this just so storytelling about this, and then people discovered agriculture, and then they could produce surplus. And so obviously then people settled down, and obviously the state emerged as the kind of highest form of political organization. And that's not true for lots of different reasons, but we won't get into that there. I guess I would say, just to follow up on some of the things that AJ said here, you're only indigenous in relation to something else, right? The Haudenosaunee, the Mi'kmaq, they didn't call themselves indigenous before colonizers came here, right? So who are the English colonized by, I would say? And, forgive me, I tend to be the angstier one of the pair here. I'm provoked by your question, I guess that's what I would say. I'm not going to respond. By being hard on you about this, but I'm going to point it out because I'm troubled by the way you put this question together, because as somebody who studies the modern politics of the far right, this question totally resonates with this preoccupation with blood and soil and nativism that drives much far right politics today. So I think I smell a bit of a red herring in your question, to be honest. So are you suggesting that immigrants are the force that need to be defended against, when the Muslim mayor of London has to come out and say, we stand upon the unceded territories of the English tribes? First of all, they weren't English tribes, were they? England's a country. Those tribes didn't call themselves English back before England as a country was consolidated as a form of state rule, right? So what are we talking about, right? I mean, obviously there were different, and Europeans are an imagined political identity too. You think people who lived in even Germany, for Pete's sake, wasn't a state, the kind of quintessential modern European state because of, the Nazi war machine. If you look at the end of the 19th century, Germany doesn't exist in anything resembling its current form. It's something entirely different. Bavarians didn't regard themselves as German in the sense that they see themselves as German today. So what are you talking about? Like I would say that's a more fruitful question. Where do the Roma fit? What about, like, and of course we could argue that there are people who figure like perhaps the Basque struggle in Spain could be thought of as something approximating an indigenous struggle against the Spanish state. I don't know enough about that struggle to weigh in confidently about that. But I would say you're only indigenous. Like that label indigenous is a political category in relation to settler colonialism. Your societies existed. They had ways of knowing, ways of governing, ways of living, ways of relating that were forcibly disrupted, dishonestly dispossessed from them by settler colonizers who didn't win most of that either by conquest or by treaty, and instead simply like by disease, by trickery, by displacement, by forced dispossession, took those territories. That's what we're talking about. And so, like, frankly, it fucking drives me nuts when modern day Canadians are all like, man, we won the war. What fucking war? What war did you win? I visited Fort Anne and Port Royal down on the South Shore a little while ago with my family. We're reading these historical plaques, right? 1600 Port Royal is founded. It's like, and the first winter, the settlers died en masse. You wouldn't even be here, would it not be for the mistaken hospitality of those poor indigenous people who reached out their hands in humanity. So, like that's what we're talking about, okay? There were people, there were nations, there were societies here that predate modern day settler colonial states like the United States, New Zealand, Australia, Canada, and elsewhere where it doesn't get recognized. So the Japanese state has a struggle with indigenous people too. You almost never hear about it, right? But there are indigenous people in modern day Japan, and they have been treated really abominably as well. Again, the struggle against settler colonialism looks different in Latin America because of the way the demographics played out and because there weren't enough settler colonials to displace indigenous people. So you had a lot more, I hate the term, but interbreeding, like it's the worst term, but you know what I mean? Mixing between those populations, producing what is called commonly in Latin America today a mestizo or mixed race population, where where it allows the ruling class really odiously to claim indigenous heritage while disavowing indigenous people in the present. So as AJ's saying, all these things, all these processes look different everywhere. So it's not that Europe has no genuine struggle, but I'm creeped out by the idea of, let's say, the mayor of London proclaiming London as unceded English territory with all that conveys in the present day context. And let's not forget, hey, interesting that you would pick England, the center, one of the primary centers of imperialism and colonialism in the last 500 years. So, if English people, if white English people today have a problem with colonial or have a problem with immigration, welcome to the world. Like you did that to other people for all that time. And now they want to come live in your country and you got a problem with it? Like for real, we're talking about Windrush here. We're talking about like all this modern day shittiness that's on the rise in Europe as Europeans, as white Europeans, freak the fuck out because the world is in crisis. And once again, turn those cutting edges on some of the most vulnerable populations. So yeah, it's a different struggle. It's a different context. As AJ said, please don't use the term Native American. It's not correct. And it's, not to yell at you about that. Lots of people do that. It's better than other terms for sure, but it's not correct. It's not accurate. And indigenous doesn't refer to an identity, just like European doesn't really. That's a political region, right? People have histories, they have cultural specificity and location, and that's what we're talking about. So yeah, and avoid the rabbit hole of nativism. It's creepy. People have always moved. It's about respectful relations. It's not about saying I was here first, so I own this land. That's not what indigenous people in Canada are saying to you. They're not like, we own this, get out of here. They're like, no, we were here. We have a right to be respected and treated in that way, like many of those settler colonials acknowledge, right? The Two-Row Wampum is one of the most ancient treaties worked out, I shouldn't say ancient, but oldest treaties worked out between settlers and indigenous people, and reflects that sentiment of two vessels, heading down the river, neither of which is trying to steer the other's course. It's a beautiful metaphor for coexistence. So how about the Mayor of London stands up and says, we're committed to peaceful coexistence amongst people and recognize the cultural richness of this society? That would be rad. Way better than saying this is, some creepy white territory.
Cool. Thanks for that. I think we'll take one more question just because we started late. And I just wanted to add a couple of readings to that last question, especially as, about about white people presenting as indigenous people. I think a really important read would be a book by another friend of ours, Daryl LaRue, which is called, what is it called? Distorted Descent. And it's about race shifting, and particularly the way in which white people endeavor to present themselves as indigenous and the problematic aspects associated with that. And these historical ideas of, mixed race, what that means, Métis as an actual sovereign nation. And then it also reminds me of other texts that kind of also engage with this idea about who is and who isn't indigenous, the importance of indigenous communities claiming people as indigenous as well as people's self-identification, which I know is not there's no consensus view on this, in large part because of the violence of settler colonialism that have separated people from their roots. But other texts to think about would be Lee Maricle's book, Conversations with Canadians, Bonita Lawrence, Mi'kmaq scholar Bonita Lawrence and Enakshi Dua, their article from way back in 2004 or 2005, I think, simply called Decolonizing Anti-Racism, because it's important for those of us also who are not white to think about how even our radical politics are sometimes implicated in naturalizing state colonial violence. And I think that was it for the text that I was going to recommend. And one last question, so I'll answer this one and I'll pass it off to Alex, who will answer it and then kind of wrap us up for this month. It's an important and short one. What does cancel culture look like on the right? So thanks for this question. I've been hoping to be able to address this in some ways. I was even thinking about trying to write an op-ed about it, but the publishers wouldn't take it. I think if you want to know what cancel culture looks like on the right, the best example is what happened with respects to Harsha Walia, who was the former executive director of the BC Civil Liberties Association, who simply tweeted something, burn it all down, in the context of speaking about, like some churches burning across the country in the wake of all of the gruesome discoveries of children and graves all over the former residential schools, and simply making that tweet put in, it was criticized so vitriolically by the right on social media that it led to a string of events that ultimately cost Walia her job, and I think cost the BC Civil Liberties a brilliant and capable leader. That's what cancel culture looks like. When somebody says, hey, you shouldn't say Native American because maybe that's not the best term to use, that's not being canceled. That's trying to help people out, or having your feelings hurt is not cancel culture. Cancel culture is when politically motivated people are trying to silence criticism, and they do so in a way that has important material consequences, that stymies the quality of debate, that tries to keep it in a kind of very conservative, like small c conservative, trying to maintain the status quo to prevent change. And especially when these things are relatively minor infractions. So you think about, just the 2 points I would make about what makes this cancel culture. Just a few weeks, several weeks out from these gruesome discoveries, nobody in the news is talking about this anymore. When the story broke, it was as if this would be the reckoning point that Canada would just simply never forget, and this and that and the other. And we rolled out all the same bullshit arguments that actually just served the purpose of reifying white supremacy in this country, because it allowed people to take a moment with their prime minister or whoever and say, that wasn't us, that wasn't the Canada that we want. We will build the Canada that we need. And then settlers run to this idea of reconciliation before they've even confronted the truth, like so many indigenous scholars, activists, grassroots leaders have been talking about. And the fact that it is not even in our news cycle anymore, just a few weeks after this, shows how irresponsible and unsincere Canada has been about this. And yet, the only person who got punished that I can see as a result of the discovery of these horrible details was a BIPOC woman who was leading the Civil Liberties Association, who lost her job because the right-wing trolls decided that that was something they needed to push for. And it reached a point where, for her own reasons and, read between the lines, she decided to correctly step away from that because of the insane amount of hate that she was receiving as a result of that. So if that's not cancel culture, I don't know what is. And in fact, I would go so far as to say that that is really the only true manifestations of cancel culture. I didn't truly believe that cancel culture was a thing until I saw that happen. So, and the reason why that makes it cancel culture is because it's about discursive power. You know what I mean? If somebody tells someone like Jonathan Kay that he's full of shit, obviously I think that it's probably true, but it doesn't too much matter. He's got thousands of followers. They don't care what anybody else says. He's not harmed by that sort of impact. But when somebody else, uses the fact that society is primed to be conservative, small c conservative, again, I'm not talking about capital C conservative, they're protecting the status quo, and somebody says, hey, that's not right. They don't have that discursive power. The Marxists talked a lot about cultural hegemony and how that works. I don't have time to get into that now, but keep that in mind, that power is always the point that you need to be focused on when you want to understand structures of oppression and structures of liberation. So I'll pass it off to Alex to comment and sign us off for this month.
Thanks, AJ. I guess I would say like the modern far right is cancel culture made manifest in the world, like straight up. You have, and I'm not talking about, again, like we're not even talking about kind of regular run-of-the-mill conservatives necessarily, although those lines have become slipperier, but certainly the cutting edge of the far right, who love to tout the necessity of what they regard as free speech. And what they really mean by that, of course, is speech that they want to engage in that benefits them, that advances their political project, not any speech, because they're always busy. Keep in mind, right? These are the same groups that keep lists of professors that they believe are too left-wing, publish them online to try and get them fired or harassed. Like what? Even if you don't like if you've bought this ridiculous notion that the modern university is filled with left-wing thinking, and as somebody who works there, I can say I wish that were true. It isn't true. They are run much like corporations, and most people are liberal or conservative, especially in the more conventional departments. But aside from that, yeah, you've got groups who invite, Jordan Peterson, right? Like the cause celeb for the longest time of every grumpy young white guy who was tired of being told that he needed to work on his shit, came out and has been a vigorous defender. No, there should be no speech act that cannot happen in society, basically, right? A full free exchange of ideas. And then this dude says he's going to start a website where he's going to keep a list of all the professors who teach what he calls cultural Marxism, which isn't a thing and doesn't really exist. But he's going to invite people to submit names to this list so they can keep an enemies list online. Like, what could be more cancel culture than that? You're actually cultivating a list of people you want to harass and destroy and make homeless and jobless. I haven't seen a leftist do something like that. So, the modern far right, they want to cancel trans people. They want to cancel indigenous people. They want to cancel Black people. They certainly want to cancel women's rights. Part of it is, like a fundamental problem with the idea of cancel culture itself. It's become this buzzword that nobody really knows what they mean by it. Everybody invokes it. And I'd say this for the left too, as an easy, lazy slogan for when somebody comes at them saying something that they don't like. But we need to be more precise than that. what we're really fighting over is the world we want to live in and the relations that govern that world. So, it's a very different thing to say, hey, I don't like the way you talk about trans people. I think that's really dehumanizing and brings a lot of violence into the world, versus the other side saying, I think trans people aren't real, and anybody who claims to be trans is really a pedophile, and that person should either be in jail or subject to like chemical castration or killed. Which of those two do you think is more akin to cancel culture, right? And just to come back to the examples that AJ gave, people freaked the fuck out when J.K. Rowling faced online backlash over her feminist appropriating radical transphobia. Yes, I just called J.K. Rowling a fart. And people like, she's being canceled. So what happened? Her like 1,000,000,001 Twitter followers all went to war for her, and she got they wrote an open letter that got published in Harper's, one of the world's foremost literary magazines, bemoaning this, and there was endless media coverage. I was pretty curious. Hey man, like I wish I could get canceled like that, get like 1 billion Twitter followers and a letter in some prestigious magazine featuring me and everybody talking about me, and still make all the money off of my Harry Potter and my subsequently like kind of forgettable novels that people continue to read anyway because I wrote Harry Potter. That doesn't really sound so bad. So let's be clear about what the stakes are. But more importantly, let me just attune you to the fact that, and this is a drum I will beat all day long, that the modern far right is very adept at weaponizing this notion of grievance and turning it as towards people as an invitation to become part of this twisted movement. And so rightly, they say the world you're in doesn't feel good, doesn't feel right. And I would agree with all of that, right? It definitely doesn't feel good, doesn't feel for all kinds of people. But their enemies and the things they point to about what's wrong in the world are totally wrong, right? They blame people further down the hierarchy than them. They blame people who have faced much more violence. They blame people who are much more vulnerable. And most importantly, they blame people who, for the most part, are not members of the ruling class, right? And they say, go to war against them. That's what cancel culture is, right? It's like, go to war against people who have less power, less prestige, and make yourself feel better by beating up on them, instead of actually unifying and then confronting our ruling class enemies to build a better world. So yeah, the modern far right is all about cancel culture. And, if you're interested in looking at that, I would really recommend a book. It's pretty academic, I gotta say. I love it though. It's great. It's a really short read. It's called Is Free Speech Racist by Gavin Titley. So check it out. It's like 120 pages long. It's a great book, and it talks about the modern free speech wars in fairly academic, but also like really important terms. So as always, folks, thanks for being with us this month. Thanks to our friends at Fernwood for being such amazing promoters and hosts of all this. Thanks to my partner in crime, Ajay Parasaram. And we're back with you in a month's time for another installment of Safe Space for White Questions. In the meantime, if you are in Kishbuktuk, pop down to the Mutual Aid Park at the corner of Shabukto and Dublin Streets. It's an amazing little experiment in meeting the needs of houseless people, showing us through a really small window what a collectively liberated world where mutual aid is the principle, what that might look like. And you don't have to show up and do a lot of work. You can just be there and hang out. I was there on Sunday, gave a little talk, and I have to say it was a lovely afternoon. Just really good people down there. See what a world that seeks to solve its social problems without violence looks like, and just go get a taste of it. And if you're antagonistic to it, go check it out too. But don't go there to start an argument. Just go there to see it, and before you make up your mind. Okay, I'd really recommend that. Anyway, thanks, folks, and we will see you in the not too distant future. Until then.